As the heavy oak door of the inner office clicked shut, a stifling tension refused to settle in the penthouse. Stripping off her trench coat, she let the dark, liquid silk slip onto a chair, prompting Damien's gaze to snap up from the ledgers. He ignored the millions in laundered cash and the bruised knuckles on his own hands, staring only at the way the fabric clung to her skin. "Where are you going in that dress?" The clock on the wall read 8:14 p.m. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago was a blur of sodium streetlights and relentless driving rain. Mira Finch closed the final spreadsheet on her monitor. She rubbed her eyes, pressing the heels of her palms against her sockets until bursts of static color flared behind her eyelids. For 10 hours, she had been moving money, routing numbers through shell corporations in the Caymans, adjusting shipping manifests for the port docks, and burying the financial footprint of a territorial dispute that had left 3 men dead in a warehouse on the South Side. She was a secretary on paper. In reality, she was the dam holding back a flood of federal indictments and rival gang retaliation. She stood up. Her spine popped in the quiet room. Mira walked over to the narrow closet tucked behind the filing cabinets. She pulled out the garment bag she had brought in at 7 that morning. She wasn't supposed to be here this late. It was a Friday. She had a reservation at 9. 10 minutes later, she stepped out of the private executive bathroom. The stiff gray wool skirt and starched white blouse were gone, shoved unceremoniously into a canvas tote. In their place was the dress. It was dark cherry silk, cut on the bias. It didn't hug her so much as it draped, liquid and heavy, moving like water against her thighs when she walked. The neckline was a soft cowl, but the back was the real problem. It scooped low, leaving her spine bare to the chill of the air-conditioned office. It was a dress meant for dimly lit rooms and expensive gin. It was not a dress for the 74th floor of Croft Holdings. She reached for her black trench coat on the chair. Leaving, the voice came from the shadow of the open doorway connecting her antechamber to the main office. Mira froze. She didn't startle. Working for Damien Croft beat the jumpiness out of you within the first 6 months. You learn to expect the quiet steps, the sudden appearances. You learn to live with the feeling of being watched by something apex. She turned slowly. Damien stood leaning against the door frame. He had stripped off his suit jacket hours ago. His tie was loosened, the top 2 buttons of his collar undone, revealing the faint, jagged edge of a scar at his collarbone. He looked exhausted. There were dark circles under his pale eyes, and his jaw was shadowed with dark stubble. He held a crystal tumbler of amber liquid in his right hand. His knuckles were raw, the skin split over the bone. Mira kept her face blank. She didn't ask about the knuckles. She never asked. "It's past 8, Damien. My shift ended 3 hours ago. The offshore transfers are cleared, and I left the revised dock schedules on your desk." Damien didn't look at the desk. He wasn't looking at her face either. His eyes were tracking the line of the silk where it caught the fluorescent overhead lights. He took a slow, deliberate sip from his glass. The ice clinked. It sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. He pushed off the doorframe. He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides, stopping just short of her personal space. The smell of him hit her. Expensive scotch, rain, and the sharp metallic tang of ozone and old blood. "Where are you going in that dress, Mira?" His voice was a low rasp. It wasn't a question. It was an interrogation. "I have plans," she said smoothly, keeping her chin level. She reached for the trench coat again, but his hand shot out. He didn't grab her wrist. He simply planted his palm flat against the leather of the chair, caging her arm, blocking the coat. "Plans," he repeated. The word tasted foul in his mouth. "With who?" "That is none of your business. I pay you to make my business your life." "You pay me to launder your money and keep you out of federal prison," Mira corrected, her tone flat, refusing to give him the emotional reaction he was digging for. "My time off the clock is my own." Damien looked down at her. His gaze dropped to the cowl of the silk, then drifted back up to her mouth. His jaw clenched, a muscle feathering beneath the skin. He hated this. He hated that she had a life outside this glass cage. He controlled the docks, the unions, the judges in the first district. But he couldn't control the fact that at 8:01 p.m., Mira Finch put on dark red lipstick and walked out of his domain. "Is it that lawyer from the 3rd floor?" Damien asked, his voice dropping an octave. "The one with the bad comb-over? Because I can have him fired tonight." "No, Damien, it's not the lawyer." "Then who?" "A man, an accountant. His name is David." Damien let out a short, harsh breath that might have been a laugh if there was any humor in it. "An accountant. You're dressing like this for an accountant. He's nice. He's stable. He talks about municipal bonds." She looked him dead in the eye. "He has never once asked me to clean blood out of a Persian rug." Damien flinched. It was microscopic, a mere tightening of the eyes, but Mira saw it. She knew him too well. For a second, the ruthless syndicate boss cracked, and she saw the tired, paranoid man underneath. A man who trusted exactly one person in the world, and she was currently putting on her coat to go meet an accountant named David. He pulled his hand back from the chair. He took a step away, putting the mask back on. Cold. Indifferent. "Fine," Damien said. He downed the rest of his scotch. "Have a nice dinner. Don't be late on Monday." Mira didn't look back as she walked toward the heavy glass doors of the suite. She pressed the call button for the private executive elevator. The chime pinged. The steel doors slid open. She stepped inside, leaning her back against the mirrored wall, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. A hand shot between the closing doors. The rubber sensors clicked, and the doors slid violently back open. Damien stepped in. He had his suit jacket slung over his shoulder. He didn't look at her as he hit the button for the parking garage. "What are you doing?" Mira asked, her stomach tightening. "I'm going home," he said, staring at the floor numbers ticking down above the door. "Or is my secretary regulating my movements now?" 74 floors. The descent took exactly 1 minute and 20 seconds. It was the longest minute of Mira's life. The elevator box was too small. The air filtration system couldn't cycle out the heavy, suffocating gravity Damien brought into small spaces. The hum of the cables vibrated through the soles of Mira's heels. "You're taking a civilian to Emilio's?" Damien asked. The quiet was broken. He couldn't help himself. Mira closed her eyes for a second. "I never said we were going to Emilio's." "You're wearing a $2,000 silk dress. You're not taking him to a diner." "Emilio's is the only place in the North Side you actually like." He turned his head slightly, just enough to catch her reflection in the polished steel doors. "They don't take reservations for nobody accountants. I pulled a favor," she said. "You used my name. I used the reservation you canceled with the mayor." Damien actually smiled at that. A dark, genuine smirk that pulled at the corner of his mouth. It made him look younger. It made him look lethal. "So you're feeding your accountant my table. I hope he tips well." "He's a good man, Damien." "A good man," Damien echoed, the smirk vanishing. He shifted his weight, turning fully toward her. The elevator kept dropping. Floor 50, floor 40. A good man doesn't know what to do with a woman who spends her days navigating sharks. He's going to bore you to death, Mira. "I want to be bored." She looked up at him, her cynicism bleeding through the professional veneer. "I want to sit across from a man who stresses about his 401k, not whether the Russians are going to firebomb his car. I want mundane." "You're not mundane." He stepped closer. Just half a step, but in the tight confines of the elevator, it felt like an eclipse. "You thrive in the dark, Mira. You pretend you don't, but you do. You handle my life better than my capos do. You don't flinch when the guns come out. You think an accountant is going to look at you, really look at you, and understand the things you've seen?" Floor 20, floor 10. "He doesn't have to understand the dark," Mira said softly, her voice barely carrying over the hum of the machinery. "He just has to leave it outside." The elevator chimed. Level P1. The doors slid open to the echoing concrete of the underground garage. Two massive black SUVs were idling near the pillars, exhaust pluming in the damp air. 4 men in dark suits stood near them. When they saw Damien, they straightened up, hands hovering instinctively near their jackets. Damien didn't look at his men. He looked down at Mira. "I can give you a ride," he offered, his voice stripped of the mocking edge. It was almost a plea. Almost. "David sent a car," she lied. She was taking a cab, but Damien didn't need to know that. Damien's jaw tightened. He nodded once, curt and final. He stepped out of the elevator. Mira watched his broad back as he walked toward the SUVs. The men parted for him like water. He was a king in the underworld, brutal and untouchable. But as the elevator doors began to slide shut, Mira saw him stop. He didn't turn around, but he stood frozen on the concrete, staring at nothing, a man entirely alone in a crowd of killers. The doors closed, severing the view. Emilio's was a sanctuary of old money and low lighting. The walls were paneled in dark mahogany, the booths lined with plush crimson leather. Jazz played from a corner piano, soft enough to allow for conversation, loud enough to drown out eavesdroppers. Mira sat in the back booth, Damien's usual booth. Across from her sat David. He was exactly as advertised. He wore a sensible gray suit that was slightly too loose in the shoulders. His hair was neatly parted. He had a kind face, though he was currently sweating profusely. He kept dabbing at his upper lip with the linen napkin. "It's just the atmosphere here," David stammered, looking around at the surrounding tables. "I mean, I make good money, Mira, but this place, I saw an alderman at the bar. How did you get this table again?" "Corporate perk," Mira said, swirling the martini in her glass. The gin was ice cold and biting. It tasted like reality. She looked at David. He was nice. He had spent the last 20 minutes explaining his philosophy on index funds. He had asked her about her day, and she had given him the sanitized version. Lots of paperwork, a difficult boss. She was intensely, suffocatingly bored. Damien was right. Damn him, he was right. The adrenaline of the syndicate had poisoned her palate. She couldn't drink tap water after living on high-proof whiskey. but she was determined to try. "So, David," Mira forced a warm smile. "Tell me about your dog, a golden retriever, right?" David's face lit up. "Yes, Barnaby. He's a handful, but he's—" The temperature in the restaurant seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mira didn't need to look up. She felt it in the base of her spine. It was a shift in the air pressure, a sudden, collective holding of breath from the patrons near the front of the room. The piano player fumbled a chord, recovered quickly, and kept playing, though the tempo had noticeably sped up. Mira slowly lifted her eyes from her martini glass. Damien Croft was standing at the maitre d' stand. He hadn't brought his men inside. He was entirely alone. He had put his suit jacket back on, smoothing out the lines of the bespoke Italian wool. He looked immaculate. He looked deadly. The maitre d', a man who usually projected the haughty arrogance of high-end dining, was practically bowing. Damien murmured something to the man, his eyes scanning the room. It took him less than 3 seconds to find her. Mira's grip on the stem of her glass tightened until her knuckles went white. "Don't you dare," she thought. "Don't you do this." Damien didn't march over to their table. He didn't pull a gun. He did something much worse. He walked over to the mahogany bar, directly in Mira's line of sight. He sat on a stool. He ordered a drink. And then he turned his body completely toward her booth, resting his elbows on the bar, and simply watched her. He didn't glare. He didn't scowl. His expression was one of mild, clinical interest, like a scientist watching a rat navigate a maze he had already trapped. Mira?" David's voice pulled her attention back. The accountant was pale. He was looking over her shoulder toward the bar. Do you know that guy?" "Which guy?" Mira feigned ignorance, taking a slow sip of her martini. "The guy at the bar. He's staring at us. Actually, he's staring at you, but it feels like he's staring at my throat." David swallowed hard. "He looks familiar. Wait, I read the Tribune. Is that Damien Croft?" David's voice cracked on the name. A civilian recognizing a ghost. "He's my boss," Mira said smoothly, cutting her steak. "Your boss?" David put his fork down. His hands were actually trembling. "Your boss is Damien Croft, the real estate developer who was just investigated by the FBI last month for racketeering," Mira supplied helpfully, "and extortion. The charges were dropped. Lack of evidence. Because I shredded the evidence," she didn't add. "Mira," David wiped his mouth. He was no longer looking at her dress. He was looking at her like she was a live grenade. "Why is he watching us? He's a micromanager." Across the room, a waiter approached their table. He was carrying a silver tray with a single, pristine bottle of vintage Bordeaux. "Excuse me, sir, madam," the waiter murmured, his hands shaking slightly as he set the bottle down. "Compliments of the gentleman at the bar." David stared at the bottle of wine. It was a 1982 Chateau Mouton Rothschild. It cost more than David's car. Mira looked past the waiter, locking eyes with Damien across the dim room. Damien raised his crystal tumbler of scotch in a silent, mocking toast. "You wanted mundane," his eyes seemed to say. "Let's see how long mundane lasts under pressure." David abruptly stood up. He threw a $50 bill on the table, ignoring the hundreds of dollars worth of food they had ordered. "I'm sorry, Mira," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking frantically toward the exit, calculating his path to avoid the bar. "You're a beautiful woman, but I have a mortgage and a dog. I can't do this." "David, sit down," Mira commanded, her voice cracking like a whip. It was her office voice, the voice she used to order hits covered up. David flinched, terrified of her now too. He shook his head and practically bolted toward the front door, pushing past a waiter to escape out into the rain. Mira sat alone in the booth. The dark cherry silk pooled around her. The jazz piano played a melancholy tune. She picked up her martini glass, downed the rest of the gin, and finally turned her head to look at the bar. Damien was already walking toward her. Damien didn't rush. He moved with the slow, deliberate economy of motion that dictated every room he walked into. The ambient chatter of Emilio's, which had flatlined the moment he stepped to the maitre d' stand, slowly began to hum again, though the volume remained noticeably subdued. He reached the booth. He didn't ask for permission. He slid into the curved, crimson leather seat David had just vacated. Mira watched him. She didn't adjust her posture. She didn't reach for her coat. She simply sat there in the dim, golden light of the table lamp, letting the silence stretch until it was a physical weight between them. He left his napkin on the floor, Damien noted. His voice was casual, a low baritone that didn't carry past their table. He was in a hurry. Clearly. Damien looked at the empty space where the accountant had been sitting, then shifted his gaze to Mira. "I've seen men run from me before. Usually, they have the decency to take their coats. It's raining outside. Your David is going to catch a cold." "You are a deeply selfish man," Mira said, the words clipped and precise. Damien's mouth twitched. He picked up the bottle of 1982 Chateau Mouton Rothschild the waiter had left trembling on the table. He inspected the label, pulled a corkscrew from his own jacket pocket, a habit from his earlier, rougher days that he had never quite shaken, and uncorked it with a soft pop. He poured a measure into the empty crystal glass set for David, then reached over and took Mira's empty martini glass. He poured her a glass of the red. "Drink," he said softly. "Gin makes you mean." "You make me mean, Damien. The gin is just a casualty." She didn't touch the wine. Damien took a slow sip of his. He let the liquid sit on his tongue, his eyes never leaving her face. He was looking at her differently now. In the office, under the harsh fluorescent glare, they were gears in the same machine. Here, bathed in shadows and jazz music, the boundaries blurred. He was finally looking at the dress. The dark cherry silk caught the low light. It exposed the sharp, elegant line of her collarbone, dipping into the soft cowl neckline. It was a dress designed to make men say stupid things. Damien didn't say anything stupid. He just looked, his gaze heavy and possessive, categorizing every inch of bare skin he could see. "Stop looking at me like that," she said, her voice dropping a register. "Like what?" "Like I'm a ledger you haven't balanced yet," Damien set his glass down. "I'm looking at you like a man who just saved you from a lifetime of beige walls and weekend trips to the hardware store. You should be thanking me." "I wanted the beige walls," Mira snapped, leaning forward. The sudden movement made the silk shift, the fabric whispering against the leather booth. "Do you understand that? I spend my life cleaning up your messes. I bribe port authorities. I doctor tax returns so the IRS doesn't seize your mother's house. I sit in rooms with men who smell like gunpowder and cheap cologne, and I smile, and I pretend it's perfectly normal. I wanted one night where the biggest conflict was whether to order the sea bass or the steak? You ordered the steak, Damien pointed out. Medium rare. You didn't even look at the sea bass. You don't want peace, Mira. You just think you're supposed to want it. You don't know what I want. I know exactly what you want. He leaned in, mirroring her posture. The smell of his scotch and rain-dampened wool invaded her space. He was so close, she could see the faint pulse beating at the base of his jaw. You want control. You want to be the smartest person in the room. And you were, until I sat down. Mira's jaw clenched tight. She wanted to slap him. She wanted to throw the $2,000 wine in his face. Instead, she picked up her glass and took a long, measured drink. The wine was perfect. It tasted like ash and velvet. Why are you here, Damien? She asked quietly. You didn't track me down across the city just to measure your ego against a CPA. What happened? The smirk vanished from Damien's face. The transition was instant. 1 second, he was a jealous man. The next, he was the head of the Croft Syndicate. His eyes went flat and cold. O'Connor's crew retaliated for the warehouse, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Mira's stomach plummeted. The mundane world of David and municipal bonds evaporated instantly, replaced by the cold, metallic reality of her actual life. When, 40 minutes ago, they hit the transport truck on I-90, took out the driver, the cargo is gone. Mira did the math in her head. The transport truck, the cash from the Southside collections. That's $3 million in untraceable bills. 4, Damien corrected. Who else knows? Just me. And now, you. He leaned back in the booth, creating physical space between them again. The capos are meeting at midnight. I needed you to rewrite the loss as a real estate depreciation for the Monroe Street project before morning. If the feds look at our liquidity tomorrow, I need the books to bleed cleanly. Mira stared at him. The betrayal was a sharp, sudden ache in her chest. You didn't come here because you were jealous. Damien paused. He looked at his scarred hands resting on the white tablecloth. No, he admitted softly. I came here because I needed my secretary. It was the truth, but it wasn't the whole truth. Mira could read the lie of omission in the set of his shoulders. He could have called her. He could have sent a car with 2 armed guards to pull her out of the restaurant. He didn't have to walk in alone, sit at the bar, and stare down her date until the man fled. He chose to do it this way. He chose to humiliate David. He chose to claim the space. Let's eat, Damien said, signaling the waiter with a subtle lift of his chin. You paid for a good steak. Then we go back to work. They ate in silence. It was the intimate, heavy silence of 2 people who had just stepped over a tripwire and were waiting for the explosion. Mira chewed her food, tasted none of it, and kept her eyes fixed on the stem of her wine glass. Damien watched the room, his eyes scanning the patrons, the exits, the shadows. He was back on the clock. And God help her, so was she. The rain had turned from a steady drizzle into a torrential downpour by the time they stepped out of Emilio's. The neon sign above the awning buzzed, casting a flickering red glow over the wet pavement. The 2 black SUVs were waiting, idling at the curb, displacing the line of regular cabs. As Damien and Mira approached, the back door of the lead vehicle swung open. A man in a dark suit stood holding a massive black umbrella, shielding them as they climbed into the back seat. The door slammed shut, cutting off the sound of the rain and the street. The interior of the SUV was a sensory deprivation tank built for war. The glass was 2 inches thick, bulletproof and heavily tinted. The air smelled of expensive leather detailing, ozone, and the faint, ever-present scent of gun oil that seemed to cling to Damien's men. A thick privacy partition separated the back seat from the driver and the armed passenger up front. They were completely alone. The engine rumbled beneath them. A deep, powerful vibration, and the car pulled away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the slick Chicago traffic. Mira sat on the far right side of the bench seat, her trench coat pulled tightly around her shoulders, hiding the silk dress. She stared out the window at the blurred lights of the city. She was already mentally drafting the dummy invoices for the Monroe Street project, shifting numbers in her head, building the paper fortress that would keep Damien out of a federal cage. "I'll need the original manifests from the Southside collections," Mira said, her voice sounding loud in the quiet cab. "I can't bury $4 million in depreciation without the initial capital trail matching up to the last quarter's projections." Damien sat on the other side of the seat. He was staring at her reflection in the dark glass. "The manifests are on the encrypted drive. I'll give you the passcode when we get to your place." Mira frowned, turning to look at him. "My place? We aren't going back to the office?" "No." Damien shifted his weight. The streetlight sweeping through the windshield briefly illuminated the sharp angles of his face before plunging him back into shadow. "The office is compromised. If O'Connor knew the route for the transport truck, he has a rat inside my crew. I'm not bringing you back to the penthouse until I know the floors are clean." Mira's heart gave a slow, heavy thump against her ribs. A rat. That changed the equation entirely. If someone on the inside was feeding information to the O'Connor syndicate, then Croft Holdings wasn't just a corporate front anymore. It was a target. "You're dropping me at home," she clarified, "and you're going to the midnight meeting with the capos." "Yes." "To find the rat." "Yes." Damien's voice was devoid of emotion. It was a terrifying sound. It was the voice of a man who was preparing to order an execution. "Damien," Mira said, turning fully toward him. The leather creaked beneath her. "If O'Connor hit the truck, he's not going to stop there. He's making a play for the transit lines. He wants the port docks." "I know what he wants." "Then you know going into a room with your capos tonight is a mistake," she pressed, the strategist in her taking over, eclipsing her anger from the restaurant. "If one of them is turned, you're walking into a confined space with a man who has already decided to kill you. You need to delay the meeting, freeze the accounts, starve them out until the rat panics and makes a mistake." Damien finally looked away from the window. He turned his head, resting it against the leather seat back, and looked at her. The distance between them on the wide bench seat felt suddenly, intensely small. "You're telling a mafia boss how to run a war, Mira?" he asked. There was no mockery in his tone, just a quiet, heavy curiosity. "I'm telling my employer how to protect my assets," she shot back. "I spent 3 years building the corporate structure for the port docks. If O'Connor takes them, he ruins my filing system." Damien let out a short, quiet laugh. It was a genuine sound, rough around the edges, lacking the polished cruelty he usually wore. He reached across the center console. He didn't grab her hand. He simply rested his fingers against the sleeve of her trench coat, just above her wrist. The warmth of his hand bled through the damp fabric. "You're incredible," he murmured, the words slipping out into the dark air before he could catch them. Mira froze. The air in the cab suddenly felt too thin to breathe. He was looking at her not as a secretary, not as a tool to clean up his messes, but as an equal. The heavy, suffocating gravity he carried with him shifted, settling entirely over her. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't what?" His fingers moved, brushing lightly against the edge of her cuff. "Don't blur the line." She pulled her arm back, breaking the contact. She folded her hands tightly in her lap. "I work for you. I fix your ledgers. I don't give you advice on street wars, and you don't touch me. We have an arrangement, Damien. If you break it, the whole thing falls apart." Damien's hand hung in the air for a second before he slowly pulled it back, resting it on his knee. The scar on his knuckles caught the faint light from the dashboard. "The line was blurred the day you walked into my office and told me my accountant was an idiot who was going to get me indicted," Damien said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "You've been running my life for 3 years, Mira. You know my secrets, you know my money, you know my enemies. You think there's a line left to cross?" "Yes." She looked him dead in the eye. "The one where I can still walk away at the end of the day and pretend I'm a normal person. You're wearing a dress that costs more than my driver makes in a month, sitting in a bulletproof car, lecturing me on syndicate strategy," Damien said, his tone utterly flat. "There is no normal left for you. Stop pretending there is." Mira turned away, staring out the window into the driving rain. She hated him in that moment. She hated him because he was right. David was a ghost to her already. The quiet, safe life she had tried to grasp at dinner felt like a child's fantasy. She belonged in the dark, in the quiet violence of the armored car, balancing blood money on a spreadsheet. The SUV slowed, taking a sharp turn onto a tree-lined street in Lincoln Park. The tires hissed against the wet asphalt. "We're here," Damien said. The SUV pulled to a smooth stop in front of a 3-story brick brownstone. It was a quiet, affluent neighborhood, the kind of place where people slept soundly and locked their doors with single deadbolts. It was entirely the wrong setting for the men in the idling vehicles. Mira reached for the door handle. "Wait," Damien ordered. He tapped his knuckles against the privacy partition. A second later, the front passenger door opened. A large man in a soaked suit stepped out into the rain, scanning the street, the shadows between the streetlights and the alcove of Mira's building. He spoke briefly into a wire at his wrist, waited 5 seconds, and then gave a sharp nod to the tinted back window. Only then did Damien push open his door. "I can walk myself up, Damien," Mira said, stepping out into the cold night air. She pulled the collar of her trench coat up against the wind. "Not tonight." He didn't leave room for argument. He slammed the car door shut. The rain hit his suit, darkening the gray wool instantly, but he didn't flinch. He walked with her up the short flight of concrete steps to the heavy wooden door of the brownstone. The lobby was small, smelling of old wax and wet umbrellas. Mira checked her mailbox out of habit, empty, and walked toward the stairwell. Her apartment was on the 2nd floor. Damien followed her. His heavy footsteps echoed on the hardwood stairs. The sound made the hair on the back of Mira's neck stand up. She had never brought him here. She kept her personal life fiercely guarded. Her apartment was the one place where Croft Holdings didn't exist. Now he was walking up her stairs, bringing the smell of ozone and impending violence into her sanctuary. They reached the 2nd floor landing. The hallway was narrow, lit by a single glass sconce on the wall. Mira stopped in front of door 2B. She dug into her leather tote bag, her fingers brushing past the discarded starched white blouse, searching for her keys. She was hyper-aware of him standing right behind her. He was too close. The hallway was too narrow. "The drive is in the lining of my coat," Damien said softly. Mira found her keys. They jingled sharply in the quiet hall. "Hand it over. I'll have the ledgers fixed by 3 a.m. I'll email them to the secure server." Damien didn't move to get the drive. Instead, as Mira slid the key into the deadbolt, he took a half-step forward. He boxed her in. His chest was inches from her back. If she leaned back, even a fraction, she would be flush against him. Mira froze. The key remained in the lock, unturned. "Damien," she warned, her voice tight. "You wore this dress to work," he murmured. His voice was right at her ear. The heat of his breath stirred the loose strands of hair that had escaped her usual severe bun. "Under the wool skirt, under the blouse. You wore this against your skin all day, sitting in my office." Mira closed her eyes. Her pulse was hammering against her collarbone, a frantic, trapped rhythm. She didn't deny it. She couldn't. "I hated it," Damien confessed. The admission was raw, stripped of his usual control. "I hated sitting there, looking at your spreadsheets, knowing you were counting down the minutes until you could take your hair down and go smile at a man who doesn't know the first thing about you." He lifted his hand. Slowly, deliberately, he bypassed the collar of her trench coat. His fingers found the bare skin of her back, where the silk cowl dipped low. Mira gasped quietly, the sound catching in her throat. His hands were cold from the rain, the skin rough and calloused. The jagged edge of a healed scar on his index finger dragged lightly across her spine. The contrast was staggering. The brutal, violent hands of a syndicate boss touching the delicate $2,000 silk, touching her. "I ruin everything I touch, Mira," Damien whispered, his fingers tracing the line of her vertebrae, sending a violent shiver down her legs. "You know I do. You see the bodies I leave behind. You hide them for me." "Then let me go," she said. The words were supposed to be a command, but they came out as a desperate, breathless plea. She didn't turn the key. She didn't push him away. "I tried," he said, his voice thickening with a dark, territorial possessiveness. He leaned in closer, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "I sat at that bar tonight, and I watched you try to be normal. I watched you die of boredom. I watched you pretend to be a tame little thing for a man who would break in half if he saw the real you. And I realized I can't do it." His hand slid around her waist, slipping under the open flap of the trench coat, pulling her firmly against his chest. The heavy solid wall of his body pressed into her back. "I can't let you go, Mira, because you don't belong out there." He turned her slowly, forcing her to let go of the keys, forcing her to face him in the dim hallway light. His eyes were no longer flat. They were entirely black, dilated with a hunger he had kept locked away for 3 years. He looked down at the dark cherry silk clinging to her body, and then up to her mouth. "You belong in the dark," Damien said, his voice a lethal promise. "You belong with me." Before Mira could form a response, before she could tell him he was crossing the line, the silence of the hallway was shattered. It wasn't a voice. It was the sharp, mechanical beep of a burner phone going off. It was coming from Damien's jacket pocket. The tension snapped like a dry twig. Damien went entirely rigid. The hunger in his eyes instantly vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating stare of a predator assessing a threat. He dropped his hand from her waist and pulled the cheap disposable phone from his inner pocket. He answered it without a word, holding it to his ear. Mira watched his face. She saw the microscopic tightening of his jaw, the slight flare of his nostrils. He didn't speak. He just listened for 10 seconds, then crushed the phone in his hand, the plastic cracking sharply under his grip. He dropped the broken pieces onto the hardwood floor of the hallway. "What is it?" Mira asked, the adrenaline of the near kiss vanishing, replaced entirely by cold dread. Damien looked at her. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small encrypted black thumb drive, and pressed it into her palm. His fingers were completely steady. "O'Connor didn't just hit the truck," Damien said, his voice flat, dead, and terrifyingly calm. "He just blew up the warehouse on the south side. 2 of my capos were inside." He took a step back, putting distance between them, rebuilding the wall. The Mafia boss had returned. The man who had just held her in the dark was gone, locked away beneath layers of impending violence. "Lock your door, Mira," Damien ordered. "Do not open it for anyone but me. If the books aren't clean by morning, it won't matter, because there won't be a syndicate left for the feds to audit." He turned and walked down the stairs. He didn't look back. The deadbolt slid into place with a heavy, metallic thud. Mira stood in the dark entryway of her apartment, her back pressed flat against the solid oak door. She didn't turn on the lights. She just stood there, listening to the frantic, erratic rhythm of her own breathing. Outside, the rain lashed against the living room windows. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows across the hardwood floor. She was alone. The suffocating pressure of Damien's presence was gone, replaced by a cold, hollow silence that felt infinitely worse. He was walking into a room full of killers, looking for a traitor, while she was supposed to sit at a desk and balance a checkbook. Mira pushed off the door. She didn't bother changing out of the dark cherry silk. She threw her damp trench coat over the back of the sofa, walked into her home office, and switched on a single desk lamp. The warm yellow light illuminated a space that was clinically organized: 3 monitors, a mechanical keyboard, and a commercial-grade paper shredder. She sat down, woke her secure terminal, and plugged the encrypted black thumb drive into the port. A password prompt blinked on the center screen. Damien hadn't given her a password in the hallway. He hadn't needed to. In 3 years, she had learned how his mind worked. He didn't use dates or names. He used physical locations, the places where he had bled. She typed, "Kildare, Yor 9014, the address of the warehouse where he had taken his first bullet. The drive unlocked. Dozens of folders populated the screen. Shipping manifests, payroll for the dock workers, bribe schedules for the precinct captains, and the Southside collections, the $4 million that was currently missing, presumed burned or stolen by O'Connor's crew. Mira went to work. The cynical, terrified woman who had almost let a Mafia boss kiss her in the hallway vanished. The architect took over. Her fingers flew across the mechanical keys, the loud, rhythmic clacking filling the quiet room. She began building the dummy corporation. She drafted retro-dated invoices for a real estate development on Monroe Street, burying the $4 million as a catastrophic loss in raw materials. She falsified the signatures, routed the paperwork through their Cayman shell, and queued it for the morning batch transfer. If the FBI raided Croft Holdings at 9 a.m., the books would show a terrible quarter for construction, but 0 illegal capital. It took her 2 hours. By 11:15 p.m., Damien's financial empire was safe. She leaned back in her ergonomic chair, rubbing her temples. The silk dress clung to her skin, stiff with dried sweat and tension. The job was done. She was supposed to log off, lock her door, and try to sleep. But a nagging, vicious itch at the back of her brain wouldn't let her. If O'Connor knew the route for the transport truck, he has a rat inside my crew. Mira leaned forward again. She pulled up the raw data from the Southside collections. The money didn't just appear on a truck. It was moved through a series of drops, verified by specific capos, and logged into a temporary ledger before transport. She started cross-referencing the timestamp on the truck's departure with the verification logs. Whoever tipped off O'Connor didn't just know the route. They had to know the exact amount in the truck to make the hit worthwhile, which meant they had access to the temporary ledger. Only 4 men had the authorization codes for that ledger. Damien, 2 of the capos who had just died in the warehouse explosion, and Arthur. Arthur was Damien's oldest capo. He had run with Damien's father. He was the man who had taught Damien how to shoot, how to negotiate, how to rule. He was practically family. Mira's hands hovered over the keyboard. She pulled up the offshore routing data for the last 6 months. She wasn't looking at Croft Holdings anymore. She was looking at the ghost data, the tiny fractional rounding errors she occasionally noticed but never had the time to investigate. She ran a deep-level audit on Arthur's sector. The screen cascaded with numbers. Mira's eyes tracked the columns, her mind sorting the data faster than the processor. There. A discrepancy. 3 weeks ago, $50,000 had been rerouted from a union slush fund into a blind trust in Delaware. 2 weeks ago, another $80,000. She ran a trace on the Delaware Trust. It was heavily shielded, but Mira had back doors built into half the banking institutions on the East Coast. It took her 10 minutes to crack the holding company's registry. The holding company was registered to a proxy firm that, according to Mira's mental database of rival syndicates, was exclusively retained by the O'Connor family. Arthur wasn't just the rat. He was being paid by O'Connor to dismantle Damien's empire from the inside. Mira stared at the screen, the glowing numbers reflected in her eyes. The 2 capos in the warehouse hadn't died because O'Connor got lucky. They had died because Arthur set them up, clearing the board of anyone who could challenge him once Damien was taken out. She looked at the clock on the wall. 11:42 p.m. The midnight meeting. Damien was walking into a room with the surviving capos. He was looking for a traitor. He would be looking at the younger men, the ambitious ones. He wouldn't be looking at his mentor. Arthur would have the room secured. Arthur would have his own loyal men at the doors. Damien was walking into an execution. Mira didn't think. The paralyzing fear that had gripped her at dinner was entirely gone, burned away by a sudden icy clarity. She knew what she was. Damien had been right. She didn't belong in beige rooms. She belonged in the dark, keeping the monsters in check. She printed the offshore routing trace. She folded the heavy stock paper, shoved it into the pocket of her trench coat, and grabbed her keys. The rain had turned the streets of Chicago into a slick, black mirror. Mira drove her own car, a nondescript, reliable sedan she usually kept parked 6 blocks away. She broke 3 red lights on her way to the industrial district along the river. The midnight meetings were never held at the penthouse. When blood was on the table, the syndicate retreated to the concrete and rust of the old shipping yards. Mira killed the headlights a block away from the Target warehouse. The building was a massive, corrugated steel structure that smelled of river water, decay, and diesel fuel. 4 unmarked SUVs were parked in a tight perimeter near the loading docks. Men in heavy raincoats stood near the vehicles, assault rifles slung casually over their shoulders. They were Arthur's men. Damien's personal guard had likely been left at the perimeter, a standard protocol to show trust during an internal tribunal. A trust Arthur was about to weaponize. Mira didn't have a gun. She didn't know how to shoot one anyway. Her weapon was folded in her pocket. She stepped out of the car. The rain instantly soaked her hair, plastering it to her face and neck. She pulled the trench coat tight and walked directly toward the loading docks, her heels clicking sharply on the wet concrete. The guards spotted her immediately. 2 of them stepped forward, raising their weapons, the flashlights mounted on the barrels blinding her. "Hold it right there," a rough voice barked over the sound of the rain. "Nobody approaches the perimeter." Mira didn't slow down. She walked straight into the blinding light. "Lower the weapon, Hayes," Mira said, her voice sharp, cutting through the ambient noise like a scalpel. "Unless you want to explain to Damien why you shot his chief financial officer." The flashlight beam dipped slightly. The guard behind the light squinted. "Miss Finch?" Hayes lowered the rifle. He looked thoroughly confused. He was a mid-level enforcer, a man Mira had personally kept out of federal prison 2 years ago by doctoring his tax returns. "The boss is in a sit-down, Miss Finch. It's closed. Nobody goes in." "The boss's sit-down is compromised," Mira lied smoothly, not breaking her stride. She reached the loading dock and stepped up under the corrugated awning, shaking the water from her coat. "The FBI just raided the South Side Holding Company. I have to get him out of there right now." Hayes paled. The letters FBI had a magical effect on men who made their living in the dark. "Arthur said total lockdown." "I don't care what Arthur said," Mira snapped, stepping entirely into Hayes's personal space. She looked up at him, her eyes cold and absolute. "If I don't get in that room, the feds freeze the payroll accounts by morning. You don't get paid. Your mother's hospice care doesn't get paid. Open the damn door, Hayes." Hayes hesitated for half a second. Then he turned and pounded his fist twice on the heavy steel door. A deadbolt clicked. The door swung inward. Mira stepped into the warehouse. The air inside was thick with cigar smoke and the metallic smell of wet iron. The space was massive, mostly empty, save for a long, scarred wooden table set up under a bank of harsh, buzzing halogen work lights. 7 men sat around the table. Damien sat at the head. He had his suit jacket off, his sleeves rolled up to the elbows, exposing the dark ink of his syndicate tattoos. His scarred hands rested flat on the wood. He looked perfectly calm, a terrifying stillness that Mira knew masked absolute violence. To his right sat Arthur. The older man looked grave, his silver hair neatly slicked back, a sympathetic hand resting near Damien's arm. The other 5 capos were shouting, their voices echoing off the high ceiling, blaming each other for the warehouse explosion. The heavy steel door clanged shut behind Mira. The sound was like a gunshot. The shouting stopped instantly. 7 heads snapped toward the entrance. 7 hands dropped instinctively beneath the table to the weapons holstered at their hips. Damien's head turned. When he saw her standing there, soaked, her hair plastered to her skull, the trench coat clinging to her frame, the careful, indifferent mask he wore for his men shattered. He stood up so fast his heavy wooden chair tipped backward and crashed onto the concrete floor. "What the hell are you doing here?" Damien's voice was a roar, stripping away the refined corporate exterior, leaving only the brutal syndicate king. Arthur frowned, standing up, slowly. "Mira, this is a closed council. Who let her in?" Mira ignored Arthur. She ignored the 5 capos who were staring at her with a mix of confusion and hostility. She walked straight down the center of the warehouse, her heels echoing in the cavernous silence. She stopped directly across from Damien. The table was between them. "You told me to clean the books," Mira said, her voice completely steady, projecting clearly across the room. "I cleaned them, but I found a discrepancy in the temporary ledger routing." Damien stared at her. His chest was heaving slightly. He was furious that she was here, furious that she was in danger. But he was listening. He knew she wouldn't have walked into this room unless the building was already on fire. "What discrepancy?" Damien asked softly. Mira reached into her pocket. She pulled out the folded, slightly damp piece of heavy stock paper. She didn't hand it to Damien. She threw it on the table, directly in front of Arthur. 3 weeks ago, $50,000 was routed from the dock workers' slush fund into a blind trust in Delaware, Mira stated, her eyes locked on Arthur's suddenly pale face. 2 weeks ago, $80,000. The Delaware Trust is managed by the O'Connor Syndicate. The authorization codes used for the transfers belonged to you, Arthur. The silence in the warehouse became absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum. Arthur looked down at the paper. He didn't pick it up. A muscle in his jaw twitched. He looked up at Damien, shaking his head slowly. "Damien," Arthur said, his voice dripping with gravelly sincerity. "She's a secretary. She punches numbers. O'Connor has hackers who can spoof authorization codes. You know this. Are you going to take the word of a civilian over the man who basically raised you?" Damien didn't look at Arthur. He kept his eyes locked on Mira. "Is it a spoof, Mira?" Damien asked. "No," she replied. The routing was executed from a local IP address. The IP address matches the private terminal in Arthur's home office. He sold the transport route to O'Connor. He sold the warehouse coordinates. He killed your men. Arthur sighed. It was a heavy, mournful sound. "I'm sorry, Damien. She's clearly under a lot of stress. I think she's lost her mind." Arthur's right hand moved. It was a smooth, practiced motion, dropping beneath the table toward his waistband. He never made it. Damien moved with a terrifying liquid speed that defied the heavy stillness he had held a moment before. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't shout an order. He simply reached across the narrow table, grabbed Arthur by the lapels of his expensive suit, and violently yanked the older man forward. Arthur crashed hard onto the tabletop, the wood groaning under his weight. Before the other 5 capos could even process the movement, Damien drove his raw, scarred knuckles directly into Arthur's throat, pinning him to the wood. Arthur choked, his hands flying up to claw desperately at Damien's arm, but Damien's grip was absolute iron. The other men at the table jumped to their feet, chairs scraping harshly against the concrete. Guns were drawn, but nobody fired. The room was balanced on a razor's edge. If Damien gave the order, the warehouse would turn into a slaughterhouse. "Hold your fire," Damien commanded, his voice echoing off the steel walls, carrying absolute authority. He didn't look at his men. He looked down at Arthur, whose face was rapidly turning a deep, mottled purple. Damien's expression was completely devoid of anger. It was something much colder. It was grief distilled into pure violence. "You taught me to verify the ledger, Arthur," Damien whispered, leaning in close so only Arthur and Mira could hear. "You taught me that numbers don't lie. Men lie." With his free hand, Damien reached beneath his own shirt, drawing a matte black combat knife from a shoulder sheath. He didn't hesitate. He didn't offer a monologue. He drove the blade down, burying it to the hilt in the center of Arthur's chest. Arthur's eyes went wide, the struggle instantly draining from his limbs. A soft, wet gasp escaped his lips, and he went entirely limp against the table. Damien let go of his throat. He left the knife in the wood. The silence rushed back into the room, broken only by the sound of the rain hammering on the tin roof. Mira hadn't flinched. She stood exactly where she was, staring at the body of the man who had just tried to orchestrate her employer's death. The smell of copper and voided bowels hit the air, mixing with the cigar smoke. Damien slowly straightened up. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped the blood from his knuckles. He turned his head, finally looking at the 5 remaining capos. They were frozen, their guns still half raised, unsure of what they had just witnessed. "Arthur sold us to O'Connor," Damien said, his voice flat, exhausted. "He set up the hit on the warehouse. He was making a play for my chair." Damien tossed the blood-stained handkerchief onto Arthur's body. "Clean this up. Put him in a barrel and sink him in the river. Then marshal your crews. O'Connor thinks we're broken. Tomorrow night we burn his docks to the ground." "Yes, boss," one of the capos murmured, holstering his weapon. The others quickly followed suit. The hierarchy had been violently, definitively restored. Damien turned away from the table. He walked around the edge, closing the distance between himself and Mira. He didn't speak. He reached out, grabbed her by the elbow, his grip firm but lacking the brutal force he had just used on his mentor, and led her away from the table, toward a small, enclosed foreman's office at the back of the warehouse. He opened the door, pushed her inside, and shut it behind them, locking it. The office was cramped, smelling of stale coffee and mold. The glass windows overlooking the warehouse floor were caked with grime. Damien let go of her arm. He took 2 steps back, leaning against the metal desk, running his hands over his face. The adrenaline was crashing. He looked older than 35 in the harsh light. He looked like a man who had just killed his father. Mira watched him. The shock of the violence was beginning to set in. Her hands, which had been perfectly steady when she was tracing offshore accounts, were suddenly trembling violently. She shoved them deep into the pockets of her trench coat. "You could have been killed," Damien said, his voice rough, scraping against the quiet of the office. He dropped his hands and glared at her. "Do you understand that? If Arthur had panicked a second earlier, he would have shot you before I could reach him. If I hadn't come, he would have waited until your guard was down and killed you," Mira shot back, her voice shaking, matching his anger. "I wasn't going to sit in my apartment and wait for the feds to tell me my boss was found dead in a loading dock. I told you to stay out of it, Mira." "I'm in it, Damien," she yelled, the carefully constructed wall of professional detachment finally collapsing entirely. "I've been in it for 3 years. I know where the bodies are buried because I buy the shovels. Stop pretending you can keep me clean while I swim in your filth." Damien stared at her. His chest heaved. The space between them crackled with an energy that was equal parts fury and desperate, undeniable gravity. He pushed off the desk. He closed the distance in a single stride, crowding her against the closed door of the office. Mira didn't back away. She couldn't. Damien reached out. He didn't grab her waist this time. He took the lapels of her wet trench coat and pushed them off her shoulders. The heavy fabric slipped down her arms and pooled in a heap on the dirty floor. She was left standing in the dark cherry silk. The dress was ruined. It was damp from the rain, clinging to her skin, the hem stained with warehouse grime. Damien looked at her. The clinical observation from the restaurant was gone. The possessive jealousy from the hallway was gone. What remained was raw, stripped-down reverence. He raised his hands. They were still faintly smeared with Arthur's blood. He hesitated, his fingers hovering an inch from her face, suddenly terrified of marking her. "I told you," Damien whispered, his voice cracking. "I ruin everything I touch." Mira looked at his scarred, bloodied hands. She looked at the man who had built an empire of violence, who had just executed a traitor to protect his throne, and to protect her. She didn't want the accountant. She didn't want the beige walls. Mira lifted her own trembling hands. She reached up, wrapping her fingers gently around Damien's thick wrists. She didn't pull away. She pulled his hands forward, pressing his blood-stained palms flat against her cheeks. Damien let out a fractured breath. He closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against hers. "You didn't ruin me, Damien," Mira whispered, the silk sliding against her skin as she slid her arms around his neck, pulling him down into the dark. "You just woke me up." He kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It was a collision, a desperate, bruising claim that tasted of rain, scotch, and total surrender. Mira kissed him back with equal ferocity, her fingers tangling in his damp hair, anchoring herself to the king of the Chicago underworld. Outside the office, the capos were dragging a body across the concrete floor. The syndicate was going to war in the morning. The FBI would be looking at the ledgers. The world they lived in was violent, corrupt, and terrifying. But as Damien's arms wrapped tightly around her waist, lifting her off the ground, Mira finally stopped trying to escape the shadows. She was exactly where she belonged. Did Mira make the ultimate sacrifice for love? Or did she just lock herself in a cage of her own making? Let me know in the comments if you think she should have stayed with the accountant, or if she belongs with Damien. If this dark, gritty romance had you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to ring the bell so you catch the next explosive story. Share this with your friends who love mafia drama, and I'll see you in the next video.